A drone attack on Iraq's prime minister. Mustafa al Kadhimi survives an attempt on his life as political instability threatens to veer further into lawlessness. What will it take to bring security to Iraq? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the attempted assassination of Iraq's prime minister. It is one of Iraq's most secure locations, but that didn't stop an almost fatal attack on the prime minister's home in Baghdad's fortified green zone. According to the Ministry of the Interior, 2 armed drones were launched from the capital in an attempt to assassinate Prime Minister Mustafa al Kadhimi. The PM survived relatively unscathed, but 7 of his security personnel were injured in the attack, which left the prime minister's residence seriously damaged. Within hours of the strike, al Kadhimi was calling for calm and promising to catch the perpetrators.
We will continue to search for the perpetrators of this heinous crime which they committed yesterday by targeting the residence of the Prime Minister. We will search for the perpetrators, and we know them very well. We know them well. We know them well, and we will find them surely.
And shortly after the prime minister spoke, Reuters, citing anonymous Iraqi security officials, reported that at least one Iran-backed militia group carried out the attack using drones and explosives made in Iran. But still, no one has claimed responsibility. Meanwhile, there's been widespread condemnation across Iraq and from Iran. Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr called it a terrorist act aimed at destabilizing the country. President Barham Saleh said it was a heinous crime and warned Iraqis not to get dragged further into chaos. And the secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council had this to say on Twitter.
The attempt for al-Kadhimi's terror is a new sedition that must be traced back to foreign think tanks, which have brought nothing but insecurity, discord, and instability to oppressed Iraqi people through creation and support of terrorist groups and occupation of this country for years.
Well, tensions between the prime minister and the pro-Iranian Fatah alliance have been high since last month's election. The pro-Iranian bloc was once the second biggest in parliament, but in October it suffered a devastating loss, and they are refusing to accept defeat, calling the whole process a sham, an accusation Iraq's Independent Election Commission has categorically rejected.
There was no manipulation in the vote count. The announcement of the results were based on legal and transparent procedures in the presence of parties' representatives and the Electoral Commission who made the appeals. Moreover, the Commission has presented to a number of candidates a report on each of the polling stations.
But while the Electoral Commission is confident the vote was free and fair, protests have continued, and last week they turned deadly. Hundreds of supporters of pro-Iranian groups rallied against the results, clashing with security forces, which left more than 100 injured and reportedly up to 4 dead. The prime minister opened an investigation into the violence, but Iraq is still no closer to forming a functional government. So what will it take to bring stability to Iraq? Well, here to discuss that now, I'm joined in the studio by Ahmed Rushdi. He's a former advisor to the Speaker of the Iraqi Parliament. Kadhim al Waeli joins us from Amman. He's a former advisor to the US-led coalition forces against Daesh. And Aymenn Jawad al-Tamimi is in London. He's a researcher at George Washington University's program on extremism and an analyst specializing in Iraq. Thanks all so much for being with me. I'll start in the studio. Ahmed, the prime minister said the perpetrators would be exposed soon, and now we're hearing reports that at least one Iran-backed group is responsible, in spite of all the other theories that are floating around. How much credibility do you give these reports and these anonymous sources so far?
Well, Andrea, we all know in the law there is clues and there is evidences. The clues always now pointed out for the blocs that lost in the elections, who are actually accused Mr. Kadhimi that he made a fraud elections. In a way or another, all those clues, seeing them as they are responsible for what's happened to the prime minister. but we're still waiting for the evidences, which the Prime Minister said that he knows who targeted him, and he will announce it, declare it loudly in front of all of the Iraqi people. Now, we're waiting for him to show us the evidences and at least to say who exactly targeting him and what are the action he should do to stop all those attacks, not only for the Prime Minister, maybe it will be the start. The Prime Minister, it will end up with all the leaders of Iraq.
Okay. Aymenn, let me ask you, I mean, if these reports are true, are Iranian authorities effectively being duplicitous when they condemn the attack? Or are they actually further removed from all of this than we might realize?
The thing is with the Iranian-backed groups in Iraq, over the past couple of years or so, you've seen emergence of some of these groups with newer names that don't seem to be formally tied to the Ashid Sha'abi Commission, which actually brings the mainstream Iranian-backed factions, if you like, under the framework of the state. So actually, it's unless a specific perpetrator is identified, and it's going to be difficult to say was the actor doing it on the orders of Iran, or was this actor acting on his or her own accord. It's very difficult to say, just as you have with some of these attacks that are claimed by some of these newer, more obscure groups against US-backed forces. They just fronts for some of the mainstream groups, or are they actually genuine rogue actors? Very hard to tell.
Okay. Kadhim, first of all, do you believe these reports? And if so, and if they are found credible, does this sort of accountability, help stabilize the situation, or does it potentially bring even worse repercussions?
I think I believe those reports, and I believe that assassination attempt. I believe in the technique. Those militias or Iran-backed militias got emboldened by the patience of the Iraqi government and Mustafa al Kadhimi. He trying to be in the middle of the road, and in politics there is no middle in the road. He is the executive power, and he's been receiving threats from those militias, and there were clear threats. Plus, they were enabled by Iran and by some clerics in Iraq, and that's why they have the courage. They had the courage and to assassinate or try to assassinate the prime minister. The technique was the militia technique. I don't believe any other entity in Iraq, either the terrorists from Al Qaeda or ISIS or other element other than the Iranian-backed militias who has all this military capabilities, who can launch the drones from anywhere in Baghdad because they control the whole city. And some of them, they accuse ISIS. I think if they accuse ISIS, that means they failed to eradicate ISIS from Baghdad. Therefore, if there's any other entity, military entity other than the Iraqi military, are the Iran-backed militias who are capable to do such attacks like this.
Okay, Aymenn, if I'm reading your expressions correctly, I'm not sure you entirely agree.
No, I agree with the point that it's not likely to have been the Islamic State. I mean, the Islamic State in the past had drone capability when they were controlling lots of territory inside of Iraq, but very unlikely they could have launched a drone attack from inside of Baghdad. So in that regard, I agree. But what I do feel is that the way you've seen various groups say claim attacks on US forces, for example, which comes very much in the same kind of context of putting pressure on Kadhimi and the Iraqi government in its relationship with the US. It's either the way you have these new groups claims the attacks, there's this deliberate ambiguity left as to whether these are independent entities sharing a pro-Iranian ideology but acting outside the framework of Iranian command, or is actually these are all just fronts for some of these more established factors, which are part of this, formally speaking, are part of the state for their integration into the Hashid Commission. And so therefore, they, Kataib Hezbollah, for example, or Asayib al-Haq, they couldn't come out and say, yeah, we did this kind of attack, because they'd say we're waging war on the state, but they claim to be part of the state.
Okay. Ahmed, I mean, how far should the government go at this point to really find complete accountability and hold those responsible to account, because this would technically be worthy of the death penalty. But there are serious risks in persecuting political opponents and a militia that obviously has the resources to try to assassinate the prime minister.
Well, it's a turning point. It's a turning point in the Iraqi politics. But let us not forget, it's an accumulative action. The losers in the elections actually want to make a pressure on Sayyid Muqtada al-Sadr to accept a sharing government, a consensual government in a way or another. They start to make demonstrations. They start to attack the gates of the green zone. Then make those attacks as violent as possible. Death happens, injured people, more than 100. Then the attack of the Prime Minister house. It shows you all those actions. Eventually, it will come into a political point that Sayyid Muqtada al-Sadr should accept a consensual government. And this consensual government should not be considering the seats, the number of seats inside the parliament, but also should consider the weight of the blocks, political blocks that have militia on the ground, which means, and that's the only explanation for what declared by Asa'ib al-Haq, by the Fatah. We want the prime minister should be like that. We want the government to be like that. We want the program of the government to be like that. It shows you how much they are making so many pressure on Sayyid Muqtada al-Sadr to accept a sharing government. But also, it's a turning point about the shape of power inside Iraq. Now we're going forward into a non-state power that have at least the power to attack anyone who will refuse or at least show some sort of non-accepting any action from those power, which eventually they are backed by the Iranian and also have the power to say we are existed and we want all these things to be happen by our agenda, not the other agenda.
Kadhim, let me ask you, I mean, can what there is of a government in Iraq right now actually fix what is happening? Or, I mean, do they have to concede, in essence, too much to the extrajudicial military activity, in order to appease various militias, including the PMUs?
Yeah, well, they do not have to concede. The government is the government. They own everything, and they own the military. They have the CTS, they have the Mukhabarat service, and they can really identify those rogue elements, of course, and they can eradicate them or they can hold them accountable. But right now, as Ahmed mentioned, the consensual system, consensual government, everything, it's about scratch my back, I scratch your back. Even those rogue elements are actually affecting the peace in Baghdad and all over the whole country, and actually affecting the political and the economical opportunities. Some countries or companies want to come to Iraq and invest their money in Baghdad, but if there is a rogue element there, how are they going to accept the fact to be there, and their interest will be under threat? If the prime minister was under a threat, then how about those small companies, Starbucks, for example, or McDonald's? So the Iraqi government can identify those rogue elements and can attack them and get rid of them. The Iraqi government, Kadhimi, has only 2 months, but he has some loyal officers in the Iraqi army and the CTS. They can initiate, and right now the rest of the world was sympathizing with Mr. al-Kadhimi, with Iraq also, and condemning that attack. Therefore, Mr. al-Kadhimi, if he takes the initiative right now, I think the rest of the world will support him morally, militarily, and politically.
And do you expect him to?
No. Inshallah. So I think he has nothing to lose. He has only 2 months. And by the way, the Iraqis, they don't look upon him as the victim. They don't like victims. They like powerful men. That's a human nature. They want someone who has initiative, someone who make the solution, not being the victim. Right now, Mr. Al Kadhimi playing the victim role, which is okay. He gained a lot of sympathies, but he need to really whip those rogue elements in a hard and big stick until the Iraqis will plot to him and get him back for another 4 years.
Okay, Aymenn, do you agree with that assessment? Because it makes it sound, I mean, I don't want to overstate it. It makes it sound somewhat easy that there is indeed a choice for Mustafa al Kadhimi to take care of this situation and actually bring relative stability to the country. Does he have that choice?
It really depends on, well, say, the first question is who will be identified as the perpetrator of this attack. And there could be an interest on Kadhimi's part or the government to suppress it if it turns out, say, to have been someone from one of the more mainstream factions. Let's not forget, actually, when the prominent Iraqi analyst Hisham al-Hashimi, who was close to Kadhimi, was assassinated in 2020, and then earlier this year, a confession was broadcast. The government actually omitted that the person who did it was affiliated with Kataib Hezbollah, which is one of those mainstream Hashid factions. So who will be identified as the perpetrator? Will there be a group affiliation named? Will it just be an individual? These are really important factors for determining what kind of initiative is taken, what kind of rogue elements exactly we're talking about that Kadhimi will go after. But yes, in general, he would, I think, have more international or solidarity and backing for whatever initiative he takes. But yeah, it's definitely not easy.
Okay, Ahmed, less than a minute. I just want to get your thoughts on what you've just heard. Is it simple? I mean, could Kadhimi really take charge here? And inshallah, will he?
Well, it depends upon all evidences that he will show to the people who targeted him. It is a very important start because it will give him legitimacy about the next step. Now, what will be the next step? It is very important to show his strength in front of not only the people, in front of all the states around Iraq, and also on international backgrounds. And he has the support already from the international community, and he can do a lot. But the most important thing now is that how he can do a procedure about taking an advantage in front of the blocs, at the same time not making them furious against him.
Right. Okay. Ahmed, we will leave it there. Unfortunately, we are out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers, but stay with us, Ahmed. We will be bringing in Human Rights Watch, actually, to discuss the situation on the ground in Iraq. I'd like to thank our other panelists, Aymenn, Jawad al-Tamimi, and Kadhim al Waeli. Thank you so much for being with us. We do appreciate it. Now, in 2019, the Iraqi government promised to fight corruption and lawlessness, to stop kidnappings for ransom, to stop militia under the guise of official security forces capturing and arbitrarily arresting people, essentially to make the country a safer place. But have they been able to achieve that? And to help answer that question, I'm joined now from Zurich by Belkis Wille. She's a senior researcher with the Conflict and Crisis Division at Human Rights Watch and was previously the organization's senior Iraq researcher. Belkis, thanks so much for being with us. Your report specifically kind of addressed that initial promise in 2019. Has any part of that promise been kept, or has Iraq only descended into worse?
We've seen the government take some limited steps at accountability. What some viewers might have seen recently was that a police officer in the southern city of Basra was actually given the death penalty on November 1st for his role in an alleged death squad that had targeted and killed at least 2 journalists who had been killed simply for covering the protests. Now, this was a limited step in the right direction, but even in his case, there were other people who were detained with him. They haven't turned up at court. They may have been released. The person he said had given him the commands to kill had been allowed to flee the country. And in his fairly explosive testimony in court, he even spoke about the direct role of the PMF in giving him the orders to kill, and the role of Iran in all of that. So it just goes to show you that, one specific prosecution may have proceeded, but it really opens up bigger questions around the entire system that is allowing these armed forces to essentially get away with murder with total impunity.
Right. And to what extent, if any, are government officials themselves actually being intimidated by, or, even at the mercy of armed criminal sectarian groups that can even officially now operate as Iraqi security forces?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Iraqi government officials are very conscious of the role that the PMF have within government officially. I mean, you have links and units that are integrated into the government that are PMF. But in addition to that, of course, you have the ability of the PMF to really put fear into the Iraqi government system, into any officials who might want to hold them accountable. I can speak to engagements I've had with judges who will be, tasked with investigating a specific killing of protesters, of activists, and they will honestly tell me, we know who are behind these killings, we have the evidence, we know it's the PMF, but we know that the state just doesn't have the power to hold them accountable. And that's really the sad reality that we're facing now. And it's a question of whether the government is even able to impose law and order anymore on the streets of Iraq.
And Ahmed, just quickly, I mean, you are an Iraqi, you work with the government, you are on the ground. You realize this is true?
Yeah, of course, of course. What Belkis said, it's frank and it's obvious in the Iraqi situation. And now more fear happened to the PMF forces because of the results of the elections. Because what Said Muqtada is saying is that we should merge all the PMF with the Iraqi army. So it shows you how much now it's a turning point in Iraq. Because what's happening is that the PMF losing power, at the same time, there is a procedure of pushing them inside the Iraqi army, and which means that losing power. And which make them now very furious. And I think this is one of the reasons of attacking the prime minister, because he's the key manager that, backed by Sayyid Muqtada al-Sadr and backed by the Marja'iyya, to push the PMF toward emerging inside the Iraqi army.
Okay. I mean, Belkis, I have to ask you, having heard everything you've said and everything you've reported, and Ahmed agreeing with it, how much does all of it, the entire situation in the government, in the security forces, how much is that alone breeding this kind of voter apathy? It's driving the protests and just destabilizing the country.
It really has had a huge effect on particularly these past elections, where we saw voter turnout very low. Historically, voter turnout in Iraq has been low, but it was exceptionally low this time. And that's could be seen as surprising. These elections were bred out of the demands of the protesters for the government to step down, because it allowed so many protesters to be killed on the streets during late 2019. And so they demanded a new government and new elections. So you would have imagined a really rejuvenized and energized youth that would want to participate in these elections, because these are the elections that they asked for. And we didn't see that. The reason we didn't see that is because youth knew that they were at risk if they participated in politics.
Do you think, if there is a silver lining to that, though, that there is almost a sense of unity in their apathy? Because they are now the majority. Those that didn't vote, they won the election by saying they reject all of it.
I hope we can see it that way, and see that something positive and galvanizing comes out of all of this. Already in 2018, in the big protests in southern Iraq, a lot of the protest slogans were anti-PMF, anti-foreign government intervention in Iraq. We saw that again in 2019. So I think there are many people in Iraq who feel very strongly that the role of the PMF and outside influence in their government and in their country really is destroying the country. And I do think that unites a lot of people in Iraq.
It unites them, Ahmed, but there's something they can do with that.
Well, let us be honest. Boycotting is a way of a political opinion. Eventually, Iraqis who boycott saying that this political system is not ours. So it shows you how much Iraq, with the youngest community in the area, in about, let's say, 5 years, how much rejection for this political process will happen. And I think even if there will be a government, it will not last only 1 year, because the government could not solve Iraq's problems, could not bring happiness, prosperity for all young men and women in Iraq. So it shows you that even if the power is still there in the hands of the militia, in the hands of the ones who won in the elections, but still 80% of Iraqis are not accepting anything from those who are now the winners or even the losers that try to make things eventually in a consensual government start to be participate also in the political process.
Okay.
The problem is that those in power now didn't understand until now is that the boycott is a political opinion. Actually, majority of Iraqis does not want this political process.
Okay. Ahmed and Belkis, thank you really so much for being with us. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.